Charles never forgot the sting of that empty altar. Years later, the memory still burned like a fresh wound, even though he tried to bury it under work, whiskey, and hollow smiles. The church had been full that day, full of guests, flowers, music, everything, except the one thing that mattered: Kathy. She never showed. No explanation, no note, just silence. He waited an hour, standing there in a suit that felt tighter with every passing second, like it was slowly choking the hope out of him. Afterward, he heard whispers about cold feet, another man, or family pressure. None of it made it easier. He left town the same week, quit his job, sold his place, vanished like smoke. For years, Charles rebuilt himself, one regret at a time. He moved to a new city, opened a small bar with George, a childhood friend who somehow always found him, no matter how far he ran. George didn't ask questions. He just showed up with a handshake, a plan, and enough sarcasm to burn down a forest. Charles appreciated that. It made forgetting a little easier. And then came Delores. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't demand attention. She just naturally held it. She started coming to the bar once a week, always alone, always with a book. Charles noticed her before she noticed him. It was the way she smiled at the pages, or how she never stayed more than to drinks. Discipline in a world that had none. They talked eventually. Small stuff, like favorite songs and lousy weather. He liked her laugh. It was sharp and unfiltered, like she'd forgotten how to fake it. Over time, Thursdays became something he looked forward to, and that scared the hell out of him. He hadn't said Kathy's name in 3 years, not once, not even when he thought about her. But now, with Delores, he found himself comparing. She was different. Delores wasn't soft in the way Kathy had been. She didn't wear delicate perfume or glide across rooms. She was grounded. She asked hard questions, called out his silences, and once told him flat out, "You look like someone who got punched in the heart and never stood back up." He didn't deny it. Months passed. Delores stayed. George teased him about her, but in that brotherly way that meant he approved. Business was steady, his chest felt lighter, and he even started playing music again, something he'd abandoned the night Kathy disappeared. For the first time in years, he felt like he was living instead of just surviving. Then, one rainy Thursday, Kathy walked into his bar. She looked the same. And that was the problem. Same nervous smile, same eyes that once promised forever. Charles felt like the floor shifted beneath him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. George saw her too, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he'd bite through it. Kathy didn't order anything. She just sat at the bar and said, "I never stopped thinking about you." Charles walked out the back door. That night, Delores found him in the alley, sitting on a milk crate in the drizzle. She didn't say anything at first, just lit a cigarette and sat next to him. He didn't smoke, but he was glad she did. It gave him something to focus on besides the storm inside him. "She left you once," Delores finally said. "That kind of leaving doesn't fade. It leaves marks." He looked at her, really looked at her, and he realized Delores was the first woman who'd ever stayed. Showed up, every single time. No drama, no games. She just showed up. "I think I've been holding my breath for 5 years," he muttered. Delores flicked ash into a puddle. "Then maybe it's time to exhale." He kissed her the next night. It wasn't a kiss born of fireworks or desperation. It was calm, sure, the kind of kiss that tells you you're safe. They didn't rush. He took time to heal. She gave him space to be messy, and slowly, Charles started believing in mornings again. They built a life not perfect, but honest. And when he proposed, it wasn't on one knee or in some fancy place. It was in the bar after closing, with her hair messy and her face tired. She said yes before he even finished asking. The day of the wedding, Charles stood at the altar again. But this time, when the music started, Delores walked in early, and that made all the difference. The day they chose for the wedding was nothing fancy. A Thursday, of all things. The same day Delores had first walked into his bar, with that quiet presence and a novel tucked under her arm. Charles didn't want a big church or stiff traditions. He didn't even want suits. He just wanted something real, stripped of the noise. Something that felt like them. It was held at the edge of the city, in an old greenhouse turned event space. Warm light filtered through the glass ceiling, and plants crawled up the walls like nature had reclaimed the place. George stood by his side as best man, somehow looking sharp despite his refusal to shave. He leaned in and whispered, "If she bolts, I'm tackling her. Just say the word." Charles smiled, but his hands were cold. He wasn't afraid that Delores would leave. That wasn't the fear anymore. It was the ghost of the past, whispering things like, "What if you don't deserve this?" He hadn't told Delores about everything, not the full truth, not how broken he had been after Kathy. He'd given her pieces, sure, but the ugliest parts were still buried deep. Then she walked in. Early. Delores wore a simple white dress, no veil, no bouquet. She smiled as she approached, like she saw right through his panic. She wasn't just marrying him, she was calming a war inside him, one smile at a time. As she reached him, she didn't ask if he was okay. She just took his hand and gave it a squeeze. That was all it took. The vows were private, spoken low between them. While the officiant gave his speech, Delores leaned in and said, "I didn't come to fix you. I came to stand beside you while you fixed yourself." Charles's throat tightened. He didn't cry, not in front of everyone, but his heart cracked open in a way that felt clean, freeing. He whispered, "And I came to be the man you never have to question." They kissed. Applause. George whooped a little too loud. It was done. Later that evening, under hanging lights and the soft hum of jazz, Charles sat quietly, watching Delores laugh with his aunt about some awful childhood memory. He couldn't stop looking at her, at how she didn't just change his life, she steadied it, anchored it. Then behind the bar, he saw a familiar figure, Kathy. She wasn't dressed like a guest. She wasn't invited. She stood just outside the celebration, at the edge of the property, her eyes fixed on him. Her expression was unreadable, not angry, not regretful, just empty, like someone who had finally realized what they'd lost. Charles stood, his chest tightening again. Delores saw it. She followed his eyes. She didn't react the way he feared, no jealousy, no fear, just a quiet nod that said, "Go on, if you need to." He walked over. Kathy didn't speak first. She waited until he was close enough to hear her soft voice over the music. "You look happy." He nodded. "I am." She swallowed, like the words were hard to say. "I shouldn't have come. I needed to see that you were okay." Charles looked at her, really looked. The girl who once made him believe in forever, now just a stranger with familiar eyes. "Why didn't you show up that day?" he asked. I waited until everyone left." She sighed, glancing down. "I got scared, not of you, but of being someone's everything. I thought I'd be swallowed by it, so I ran. Without a word, I thought silence would be kinder than the truth." He didn't respond right away. Then, after a beat, he said, "You were wrong." Kathy nodded. "I know." He looked back at the party at Delores, twirling a flower girl with wild hair and no rhythm. "She showed up early," he said, more to himself than to Kathy. "That's how I knew she was different." Kathy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "She's lucky." "No," Charles said, turning back to her. "I am." And with that, he walked away, never looking back. The honeymoon wasn't in some tropical escape or luxurious five-star hotel. Charles and Delores didn't need grand destinations to feel like they were somewhere new. They chose a cabin, deep in the mountains, far from everything. No phones, no signal, no noise, just snow-covered trees, a fireplace that cracked through the silence, and a bed that creaked like it had stories of its own. Delores tossed her bag onto the couch and laughed. "This place smells like old books and pine needles." "Perfect." Charles stood by the window, hands in his pockets. The last conversation with Kathy still hovered in the back of his mind, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. He didn't tell Delores everything she'd said. He didn't have to. That chapter was closed, but the scar was real. A reminder that trust, once broken, never came back the same. Delores kicked off her boots, walked over, and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. "You're too quiet. What's crawling around in that head of yours?" He leaned back into her. "Just thinking about how far I've come. From being left at the altar to finally getting the girl." He laughed softly. "Something like that." She turned him around and looked up. "Do you still feel it? The old pain?" He hesitated. "Sometimes. It's like a ghost. Doesn't haunt me, but it shows up when I least expect it." She didn't flinch or get offended. Delores always had a way of standing firm in the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it got. Good, that means it mattered. But don't give it more power than it deserves. They spent the next few days wrapped in something warm and rare peace. Morning coffee by the fire, long walks in the snow, games of cards that always ended with Delores cheating, and soft talks that drifted late into the night. They didn't talk about the past much. They talked about names for future kids, about whether they wanted a dog or two, and whether the bar should get a karaoke machine. Delores was firmly against it. I'm not listening to George butchering Whitney Houston every Friday night, she said, sipping wine with her feet in Charles's lap. But peace has a strange way of attracting the past. On the third morning, as Charles stepped out to bring in firewood, he found a letter tucked under the door. No stamp, no envelope, just a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. He opened it. I never meant to ruin you. I just didn't know how to love you properly. Seeing you now, it's clear someone else does. You deserved that all along. Kay, he stared at the paper for a while. No anger this time, just a hollow kind of acceptance. He folded it, slipped it into his coat, and stepped back inside like nothing happened. Delores was making pancakes in nothing but his flannel shirt, her hair tied up and messy. She turned when she heard him and smiled in that way that made everything still. Firewood, or did you go out there to become one with nature? He grinned. I found something, a reminder, but I'm done holding on to ghosts. She tilted her head. You sure? Yeah, I've got something better now. He dropped the letter into the fireplace without showing her. She didn't ask what it said. She just nodded and flipped a pancake like it was just another regular morning. They didn't need closure. They had each other, and that was enough. A week after the honeymoon, life settled into that strange rhythm people often call normal. But for Charles, normal had never been this good. The bar was busier than ever, partly because George kept bragging about the wedding of the decade to every customer who walked in. Delores had moved in fully now, her books lining the living room shelves, her hairbrush in the bathroom drawer beside his razor. There was no awkward transition. She just fit, like she'd been meant to be there all along. Still, Charles noticed something. Delores had been quieter lately. Not sad, not distant, just thoughtful. She'd always been good at hiding things under sarcasm and that easy smile. But Charles was learning her patterns. The way she'd clean a little more aggressively. The way she'd read the same page twice and not realize it. One evening, while she curled up on the couch with a blanket and a crime novel, he sat beside her and gently asked, "What's been on your mind lately?" She blinked like she'd been pulled from far away. You really want to know? Always. She hesitated. You ever wonder if I'm just your rebound? That hit harder than he expected. He reached for her hand, surprised at how cold her fingers were. Where's this coming from? She looked down at their interlocked hands. I know how deep that scar goes, Charles. I see it sometimes. You look at me like I'm a second chance, and I wonder if I'd still be enough if she had never left. He hated how real her words felt, because he had thought about that. Not lately, not in ways that mattered. But yeah, the what-ifs were part of being human. But he shook his head. Delores, you weren't the second chance. You were the first right thing. I didn't choose you because she didn't show up. I chose you because you did over and over, when it would've been easier to walk away. She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for days. Still, the conversation opened a door. One that didn't close as easily as it had opened. The next morning, Delores was gone before he woke up. She left a note, said she needed space to think and would be staying with her sister for a few days. No fight. No drama, just distance. Charles stood in the kitchen holding that note, the ache creeping back in like a wave he'd already drowned in once. He didn't call her. He respected her need to breathe, but the silence was worse than anything Kathy had ever given him. Because Delores hadn't disappeared, she'd chosen to step back. That choice stung. George showed up that night, as always, like he could smell emotional crises from across the city. He poured them both a whiskey and asked, So, how long before you screw this one up too? Charles shot him a look. Helpful. George sipped. Look man, I watched you fall apart once. I glued your sorry ass back together with liquor and bad advice. But Delores? She's not someone you can afford to lose by being passive. Go fix it. Charles nodded. She asked if she was just a rebound. George whistled. Oof. That's the kind of question that either fixes a relationship or explodes it. The next day, Charles drove out to her sister's house. It was raining again, always the damn rain when life hit hard. Delores answered the door in sweats, her eyes tired but dry. He didn't wait. I don't want to live in a house where I have to prove daily that I've moved on. But if I have to, I will. Not because I owe it to you, but because you're worth that fight. She looked at him like she was still trying to believe him. He stepped closer. I love you. Not because you're not Kathy. Not because you came after the pain. I love you because you made it worth something. You're not the chapter after. You're the reason I closed the damn book. Delores didn't cry. She didn't run into his arms like in some romance movie. She just opened the door wider and said, okay, then come in. But this time, don't ever make me ask if I matter. I won't. And he didn't. Life after that talk wasn't instantly perfect, but it was honest, and that made all the difference. Delores moved back in the next day, not with fireworks or grand declarations, just a quiet unpacking of a bag and a deep sigh that said, we're trying again. That was her way, no drama, no noise, just presence. Charles learned quickly that real love wasn't in the big moments. It was in how she handed him coffee in the morning without asking, how she touched his back gently when she passed behind him in the kitchen, how she didn't need to say I love you every hour to mean it every second. But peace again was short-lived. It was George who told him first. Late one night, as they sat on the bar's back steps after closing, George lit a cigarette and said, you remember Eddie Marsh? Charles frowned. Vaguely. Why? He's back in town. Works for some real estate group now. Word is, they're trying to buy out this whole block. Charles raised a brow. This bar? George nodded. Ours. Said if we don't sell, they'll force it through zoning changes. Said we're sitting on prime redevelopment land. Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. This place isn't just a bar. I know what it is. George cut in. But they don't care. And here's the kicker, Eddie used to date Kathy. Back in the day. Before she left you. Charles sat back, the air growing heavy around him. You think this is personal? I think people like Eddie never forget being second choice. And now he sees a chance to take something from you. Charles didn't want to believe it. But the next day, the letter arrived. Formal, printed on thick paper, offering a disgusting amount of money for the bar. Enough to make a man stop and think. Enough to tempt someone who hadn't built his new life inside those walls. Delores read the letter with tired eyes. You selling? He shook his head. Not even if they doubled it. She smiled a little. Good, because I fell in love with you somewhere between the fourth stool and the jukebox. I'd hate to lose that. But Eddie didn't back off. The pressure came fast, health inspections out of nowhere, suddenly delayed permits, whispered threats to vendors. Charles saw the game being played. He'd lost something once because he stayed quiet and hoped for the best. This time, he wasn't that man anymore. He started making noise, public noise, called the press, got local business owners involved, ran events that raised community support. George suggested they rename their Friday night special to Go to Hell Eddie Whiskey Shots. It worked. The bar packed out every weekend. Charles stood behind the counter like a man defending a home, not just a business. One night, Eddie walked in. He didn't look like much. Clean suit, smug face, the kind of man who thought owning a watch made you respectable. He sat at the bar and gave a smirk. So, you're the stubborn kind. Charles didn't smile. You came all this way to tell me that? Eddie shrugged. I came to give you one more offer before we bury this place under paperwork. Charles leaned in. Let me make you an offer. Get the hell out of my bar before I pour a drink down your throat. You won't forget. Eddie stood, adjusted his cufflinks and gave a smirk that oozed revenge. You always did know how to lose the good things in life. Some of us don't wait around at the altar, Charles. We take what we want. Delores appeared behind Charles then, calm as ever, drying her hands on a towel. She looked Eddie dead in the eye and said, funny, because what I wanted showed up. Early. Eddie left. That night, Charles kissed her behind the bar, lights low, music soft. How do you always know exactly what to say? She touched his cheek. Because I know what it feels like to be someone's second thought. And I never want you to feel that way again. He kissed her again, longer this time, outside. The wind howled. Inside, they held on. The fight against Eddie's company dragged on longer than anyone expected. Weeks turned into months. But if there was one thing Charles had grown into since that long-ago wedding that never happened, it was patience. That man who once stood, trembling at an altar, was gone. What remained was someone who understood that real battles are won in inches, not miles. He wasn't fighting for a bar anymore. He was fighting for what the bar meant: for second chances, for healing, for roots that had finally found ground solid enough to grow in. Delores supported him every step of the way, though Charles noticed she'd been keeping something from him again. A shift in her mood, quieter phone calls in the other room, sudden moments where she'd get lost in thought and shake it off too fast when he noticed. He didn't push at first, then one night, he found her on the porch, sitting alone, just staring up at the sky. He leaned against the doorway. "You look like someone who's about to break a heart." Delores didn't look back, maybe just trying not to. He came over and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "Talk to me." She exhaled slowly. "I missed a period, too, actually." His heart dropped, not in panic, but in the sheer weight of what that could mean. He looked at her carefully. "You think you're pregnant?" "I know I am." 1,000 things ran through his mind. Fear, hope, guilt, excitement, all tangled into a knot he couldn't undo fast enough. Delores looked at him, her voice softer now. "I wasn't sure how to tell you. I didn't want it to feel like pressure." Charles took her hand and kissed it. "It doesn't. It feels like maybe the start of something new, something right." She smiled a little, but he saw the worry in her eyes. "Do you really want this?" "I want you, and whatever comes with you." Delores leaned her head on his shoulder. "You really mean that?" "With every part of me." From that night on, their plans started to shift. Talk of expansion at the bar turned into talk of baby-proofing the apartment upstairs. Charles started paying more attention to health insurance. George grumbled about being promoted to uncle, but deep down, he was the first to buy a onesie that read "Bar Baby in Training." But not everyone shared the joy. Kathy called. It was a random afternoon. Delores was out visiting her sister, and Charles was organizing inventory in the back. The phone rang, and he almost didn't answer, but something in him, maybe old instinct, picked up anyway. "Charles?" Her voice hadn't changed. He went quiet for a beat. "What do you want?" "I heard what's happening. With the bar. And with everything else." He closed his eyes, jaw tight. "How did you even?" "I still know people. This town's smaller than you think." He didn't respond. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Again, I know it doesn't fix anything. But I see now what I ran from. I ran from the kind of love people spend their whole lives hoping for. I just didn't know how to accept it then." He stayed silent. He wanted to yell. He wanted to hang up. But mostly, he just wanted to go back to before the phone rang. "You've built something beautiful, Charles," she added. "And I ruined something that could have been. I hope she knows how lucky she is." "She's not lucky," he finally said. "She chose me. She stood by me when I was still bleeding. That's not luck. That's love." Kathy exhaled. "I deserve that." He hung up without saying goodbye. Delores came back later with baby books and a soft look in her eyes. "I've been thinking. I want to name her Grace, if it's a girl, because that's what saved us." "Grace." He smiled, all the pain in his chest fading like steam from a glass. "I think Grace is perfect." They stood in the middle of their quiet home, holding each other like they never wanted to let go. And this time, they wouldn't. The day the official letter arrived, Charles was wiping down the bar, prepping for another Friday night rush. The envelope had the city seal on it, cold and official, like every other notice they'd received over the last few months. He didn't even open it right away, just held it, staring, heartbeat slow but heavy. Delores walked in behind him, now visibly pregnant, wearing one of his old jackets stretched tight over her growing belly. She caught the look on his face instantly. "That the final word?" He nodded but didn't open it. "Feels heavier than it should." Delores leaned over the counter. "Well, open it before George sees it and starts sharpening his baseball bat." Charles cracked a smile and finally tore it open. Silence, then a breath. He read the letter twice, then once more out loud, just to believe it. Zoning proposal denied. Community support protected. No action required. They'd won. The city had backed off. Eddie and his sharks couldn't touch the bar, couldn't gut it for condos, couldn't erase the life they'd built there. Delores didn't say anything at first. She just walked around the counter, wrapped her arms around him as best she could with her belly between them, and whispered, "We made it." He held her close, and for the first time in years, there was no past nipping at his heels. No regrets in the room, just victory. Hard-earned, scarred, but real. George barged in 10 minutes later with 2 pizzas and an energy drink, ready for war as always. "So, are we dead or alive?" Charles grinned and held up the letter. "Alive, and officially untouchable." George pumped a fist in the air. "I knew it. I told you Eddie's forehead was too big to win anything. The bar was packed that night." Charles didn't tell most of the regulars about the win, they just knew somehow. The air was lighter, the music louder, the drinks stronger. Delores stayed behind the counter for most of the night, sipping soda and watching it all unfold like a queen overlooking her kingdom. Around midnight, Charles stepped outside for some air. It was cool, the kind of night where you could actually hear yourself think. Delores followed him out after a while, hands resting over her stomach like she was guarding something sacred. They stood together in silence, shoulder to shoulder. "You ever think about what would have happened if she had shown up?" Delores asked quietly. Charles turned his head, surprised. "You mean Kathy?" She nodded. He thought for a long second before answering. "Yeah, I used to think about it all the time. How our lives would have looked. What kind of man I'd have become if we'd gone through with it. But now, I don't care. Because none of that would have led me to this. To you, to Grace." Delores smiled at the name. She'd been saying it more often lately. Practicing, maybe. "You think you would have been happy?" "I think I would have settled. That scares me more than being left dead." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You didn't settle now." "No, I didn't." She took his hand and guided it to her belly. "She's kicking," she said. He felt it, just a small thump beneath his palm, like a heartbeat trying to say, "I'm here." Charles's eyes burned, and he didn't fight it. Let the tears come, not from sadness, from the overwhelming rush of everything, what was lost, what was found, and what was coming. "You okay?" Delores whispered. He nodded. "Yeah, for the first time in years, I'm really okay." Back inside, the bar lights glowed warm. The laughter, the music, the sense of belonging, it all wrapped around them like a blanket. The missed wedding no longer haunted him. It had been a scar, sure, a deep one, but now, that scar had healed into something stronger. A reminder of who he used to be, and how far he'd come. And this time, the woman by his side didn't run late, she showed up early. Spring came gently that year. The city thawed, trees bloomed, and everything seemed to soften. The streets, the sky, even Charles. He was different now. The man who once stared blankly at church pews, hollowed out by betrayal, was gone. In his place stood someone rooted, someone who'd been broken in half and rebuilt with steadier hands. He smiled more, slept deeper, dreamed bigger. Grace was born on a rainy Tuesday, just after midnight. Dolores's labor was long and quiet. No screaming, no panic, just deep breathing and the kind of stubborn strength Charles had fallen in love with. He held her hand through every contraction, whispered terrible jokes just to make her roll her eyes, and when Grace finally arrived, slick and squirming and perfect, he cried harder than he ever thought possible. She had Dolores's nose, and his eyes. They named her right there. No hesitation. Grace, not because she was peaceful or delicate, but because she was proof of it. Proof that even the ugliest pain could grow into something beautiful if you gave it enough time and love. George visited the hospital the next morning, bringing donuts and a hand-drawn "bar closed for baby reasons" sign. He held Grace with all the grace of a man who had no business holding anything that fragile and said, "She's already smarter than you. I can see it in her eyes." Delores laughed. Charles took a photo of them right then. George in his ratty jacket, Grace swaddled like royalty, Delores glowing through exhaustion. That photo stayed on the bar wall forever. As weeks passed, life slowed in the best way. Mornings started with Grace's soft cries and the smell of coffee. Afternoons meant naps on the couch with Delores, Grace curled against his chest. Evenings, the bar still buzzed, but now Charles left early sometimes because home had finally outranked hustle. One night, as they sat in the quiet after putting Grace down, Delores turned to him, brushing hair from her face. "You ever think about writing it down? Everything we've been through?" Charles raised a brow. "Like a book? Why not? You've got stories. A whole damn life behind that bar counter." He looked at her, really looked. Yeah. But would anyone believe it? Dolores smiled. Maybe not, but it's real. And maybe someone out there needs to know that healing isn't loud. Sometimes it shows up quiet. Sometimes it shows up early. He kissed her then. Long, slow, the kind of kiss that doesn't rush toward anything, it just exists. Like breath, like heartbeat. That night, Charles sat at the kitchen table after everyone had gone to sleep. He opened a notebook, stared at the first page for a long time, then finally wrote, "Every missed wedding was a scar. But the real miracle? I didn't stop waiting. And this time, someone showed up early." He kept writing, page after page. Not to relive the pain, but to honor it. Because every broken thing had led him here. To Grace, to Dolores, to the life he thought he'd never get. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, Charles realized something beautiful. The scars didn't hurt anymore. They just reminded him how far he'd come. The end.